In 1979, in a small college town in Utah, a computer science professor and one of his graduate students sat down to write a piece of software that neither of them thought would ever leave the state. The professor's name was Alan Ashton. His student was Bruce Bastian, a man who had actually studied music before switching to computers, and who once said the only reason he learned programming in the first place was to make marching band formations easier to design on paper. Neither of them set out to build one of the most dominant pieces of software in American history. They just wanted to solve a problem for the city of Orem, which had hired them to build a word processing program for a mini computer nobody outside of City Hall had ever heard of, called a Data General Nova. That contract paid them about $20,000. It's the kind of number that sounds almost like a punchline next to what came next, but it's worth sitting with for a second, because everything about this story starts from that same unglamorous place. Two guys in Orem, Utah. A government contract nobody in California would have noticed, and a piece of software that, within a decade, would be sitting on more American office desks than any other program on Earth. It would make its founders billionaires. It would become so deeply embedded in the daily rhythm of legal offices, government agencies, and corporate America that entire professions organized their workflow around it. Secretaries were hired specifically because they knew it. Law firms measured a new hire's competence by how fast they could move through it. And then, in the span of roughly 3 years, it collapsed so completely that most people under the age of 40 have never even heard its name. This is the story of WordPerfect, and more importantly, it's the story of exactly how a company that had already won, that had already beaten every competitor standing in front of it, still managed to lose everything to a competitor that hadn't even entered the race yet. If you worked in an office anywhere in the United States between roughly 1985 and 1994, there's a real chance you don't need me to explain what WordPerfect looked like. You remember the blue screen and the white text sitting on top of it, glowing in a way that felt strangely calming after a long day. You remember the plastic keyboard template that sat above your function keys, because nobody in their right mind memorized which combination of Shift and Alt and Control did what without it. Function key 7 pulled up your print menu. Shift plus F7 did something slightly different depending on which version you were running, and if you got it wrong, you learned fast because the program didn't hold your hand the way modern software does. And then there was reveal codes. If you know, you know. It was this strange little split-screen view hidden underneath your document that showed you every single formatting command buried inside your text. Bold codes, underline codes, tab codes, margin codes, laid out like a second, invisible document running just beneath the one you were writing. It looked intimidating the first time you saw it, but once you understood it, it gave you a level of precision and control that later word processors, for all their friendlier interfaces, never quite matched. People who learned reveal codes in 1988 will still tell you today that modern Word feels like flying blind by comparison. If you were a lawyer or worked anywhere near a law office, WordPerfect wasn't just software to you. It was the software. Legal documents live and die by precise formatting. Footnotes have to land exactly where they belong through a 100-page brief. Page numbering has to survive edits without breaking. Line numbering, required in many courts, has to stay perfectly aligned no matter how many times a paragraph gets revised at 11 at night before a filing deadline. WordPerfect did all of that better than anything else on the market, and law firms noticed immediately. By the late 1980s, something close to 80% of American law firms were running on WordPerfect, and that loyalty wasn't the result of a clever ad campaign. It was earned one filing deadline at a time, by secretaries and paralegals who had learned the program once and simply refused to relearn something else for a company that hadn't given them a reason to. The company behind all of it started life with a name that sounds almost quaint now: Satellite Software International. Ashton and Bastian ran it out of Orem, and they built a culture that looked nothing like the tech companies we picture today when we think of Silicon Valley in the 80s. Bastian, in particular, was known for treating the company almost like an extended family rather than a corporation. Former employees have talked for years about company parties that felt more like a small town gathering than a shareholder event, about a founder who knew people by name across departments that had grown into the thousands, about a workplace that didn't feel like California because it very deliberately wasn't trying to be California. It was Mormon, Utah. It ran on its own values around work and community. And for a company selling software, that culture became an unexpected competitive advantage rather than a quirk to overcome. By 1986, WordPerfect had overtaken WordStar, the word processor that had dominated the earliest years of personal computing, and had once been the undisputed king of the category. By the end of the decade, WordPerfect controlled something close to half of the entire word processing market in the United States, and by the early 90s, in the DOS environment specifically, its dominance was even more overwhelming than that. If a company issued you a computer in 1990 and told you to write a memo, there was a genuine chance the first thing you'd see on that screen was that unmistakable shade of blue. Here's the part of the story that gets skipped over in most quick retellings, though, because it's tempting to assume WordPerfect simply had the better product, and that's the whole explanation. The truth runs a little deeper than that, and it explains why the eventual downfall stings so much more than a simple story of technology losing to better technology. WordPerfect won because it paid an almost obsessive, old-fashioned level of attention to something most software companies of that era treated as an afterthought buried in the budget: customer support. In the 1980s, if you called WordPerfect's toll-free support line with a problem, you got a real human being, usually within minutes, and that person would stay on the phone with you, patiently until your document was fixed. No hold music looping for 45 minutes. No tiered support plans separating paying customers from everyone else. No being routed through 5 different departments before anyone actually looked at your screen. At a moment when computers were still genuinely frightening to a huge percentage of office workers, many of whom had learned to type on a manual typewriter and were being handed a glowing screen for the first time in their careers. That kind of support built a level of trust that no advertising budget could ever manufacture. People didn't just use WordPerfect. They depended on it, the way you depend on a mechanic who's never once overcharged you, and they knew the company had their back if something broke at the worst possible moment. That trust is exactly what makes the second half of this story sting, because the thing that eventually took WordPerfect down wasn't a better word processor showing up out of nowhere. It was a series of decisions made by smart, experienced people about how to handle a shift in computing that the company genuinely saw coming and still somehow managed to fumble. The shift was Windows. When Microsoft began pushing the entire industry toward a graphical operating system through the mid to late 1980s, WordPerfect's leadership faced a choice. And it's a choice that tech historians still argue about today. Do you commit fully to rebuilding your product from the ground up for this new graphical environment, even though your existing DOS version is still printing enormous amounts of money and your customers seem completely happy with it exactly as it is? Or do you protect what's already working, keep investing in the version people already love and depend on, and treat Windows as a smaller side project until the market actually forces your hand? WordPerfect chose to hedge. And hedging in a genuine platform transition turned out to be the single most expensive decision the company ever made, even though at the time, every individual choice inside that hedge looked reasonable. While Microsoft poured enormous resources into building Word specifically for Windows from the studs up, refining it release after release, bundling it with other tools, making it feel native to the operating system that millions of first-time computer buyers were now encountering by default on brand new machines, WordPerfect's Windows version arrived late. And when it finally did ship, longtime users found it clunky and unfamiliar. It didn't feel like the fast, keyboard-driven tool they'd spent years building into their own muscle memory. It felt, in a lot of very real ways, like a DOS program wearing a Windows costume over the top, because that's essentially what it was under the hood. Meanwhile, something else was happening that WordPerfect's leadership badly underestimated, and it had nothing to do with word processing at all. Microsoft wasn't just selling a word processor anymore. It was quietly assembling a bundle: Word, Excel, and eventually PowerPoint. packaged and sold together as Microsoft Office, at a price that made buying separate tools from separate companies start to look almost irrational to a purchasing manager staring at a budget spreadsheet. WordPerfect made a spreadsheet too, called Quattro Pro after they picked it up through an acquisition, and other Office tools besides. But it never wove them together into the same seamless bundle, and critically, it never had the operating system home field advantage that Microsoft was quietly baking into every single copy of Windows it shipped to computer manufacturers around the world. By the early 1990s, the market share numbers that had once made WordPerfect look nearly untouchable started to bend the other direction. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The way these things always seem to happen in hindsight. Longtime loyal offices, the exact same law firms and government agencies that had refused to switch away from WordPerfect for the better part of a decade, began quietly migrating to Word. Not necessarily because anyone in those offices wanted to. In a huge number of cases, they migrated because new hires straight out of college had learned Word in school computer labs and had never touched WordPerfect in their lives. Because new computers were arriving on desks with Word pre-installed and WordPerfect nowhere in sight. Because the entire surrounding ecosystem of shared templates, saved macros, and coworkers' existing files had quietly shifted underneath everyone's feet before most people even noticed it happening. In 1994, Novell bought WordPerfect for roughly $1.4 billion, hoping to bolt it onto their own networking business and build a rival Office suite that could stand toe-to-toe with Microsoft's bundle. It didn't work, and it didn't take long to not work. Barely 2 years later, Novell sold the company off to Corel at a staggering loss, and the WordPerfect that had once defined an entire era of American office life became a shrinking footnote inside a company most people had never heard of and would soon forget existed too. If you talk to people who actually worked at WordPerfect through those years, the story they tell isn't really about bad engineers or bad ideas. It's about timing, and about a company culture built on patience, loyalty, and taking care of the customer in front of you, that simply moved too slowly for a moment in computing history that rewarded raw speed above almost everything else. Some former employees describe watching the shift happen in real time with a kind of helpless frustration, knowing internally that the Windows version needed to ship faster, watching Microsoft close the gap month by month in trade press reviews, and running into the exact same wall that dominant companies keep running into throughout the history of technology. When you've built something that customers already love, it is enormously difficult to convince the people signing off on budgets and resources that the thing everyone loves needs to be torn apart and rebuilt from the foundation up before it's actually visibly broken. Nobody wants to burn down a house that isn't on fire yet, even when the smoke is already curling up from somewhere underneath the floorboards. There's also a quieter, more human layer buried underneath this story that rarely makes it into the corporate retrospectives written by business journalists decades later. For the people who worked that legendary WordPerfect support line, for the secretaries and paralegals who built entire careers around knowing every function key combination by heart without ever glancing at the template, for the office managers who personally trained an entire generation of new hires on reveal codes, this wasn't just a routine product transition happening somewhere off in the distance, it was the end of a specific, familiar way of working that a genuinely large number of people had come to love, in the way you love any tool that's carried you competently through years of your working life. You can still find longtime legal assistants today, now well into their 60s, who will tell you, half joking and half completely serious, that they never fully forgave Microsoft for what happened, and that somewhere in a closet or a bottom filing cabinet drawer, they still have an old WordPerfect manual they can't quite bring themselves to throw away, even 30 years later. And here's the twist that makes this story worth telling in full, instead of leaving it as just another cautionary tale about a company that lost a war to Microsoft. WordPerfect never actually died. It's still sold today, still updated on a regular release cycle, and still used by a surprisingly large, stubbornly loyal community of legal professionals across the United States and Canada, many of whom will tell you, without a shred of hesitation or nostalgia clouding their judgment, that its legal-specific formatting tools remain genuinely better than anything Microsoft has ever built, even now. Courts in several states still officially accept filings formatted in WordPerfect. Some judges' chambers, to this day, run it as their primary word processor. It became, in a strange and almost poetic way, the exact opposite of what it once was. Instead of being the default choice for tens of millions of people who never gave it a second thought, it became the deliberate, considered choice of a much smaller, far more devoted community that never once stopped believing it was the better tool for the specific job they needed done. That's an unusual kind of legacy for a piece of software that once ruled the American office the way WordPerfect did at its peak. It didn't vanish the way most fallen tech giants tend to vanish, swallowed whole by a bigger competitor and erased from memory within a generation. It shrank down deliberately and almost gracefully to the people who genuinely preferred it over everything else on the market, and it's still sitting there today, quietly doing its job in law offices most of us will never set foot inside for the rest of our lives. So here's a question worth sitting with, and it reaches well beyond WordPerfect specifically. How many other tools like this one were sitting on your own desk back in the 80s and 90s? Tools you trusted completely. Tools an entire office ran on without a second thought. How many of you learned reveal codes years before you ever touched a computer mouse for the first time? How many of you actively fought against switching over to Word when your office finally forced the transition on everyone, simply because the thing you already knew inside and out did the actual job better, no matter what the new default software happened to be? If that's you, if you can still picture that unmistakable blue screen in your head right now, if you remember exactly where that little plastic template sat above your keyboard, I'd genuinely like to hear about it down in the comments because stories like that one are the real history here, far more than any dry timeline of corporate acquisitions and market share percentages could ever capture on its own. Somewhere out there right now, someone reading this still has an old 5.25-inch floppy disk sitting in a drawer they haven't opened in 20 years, with the words WordPerfect 5.1 printed on a fading label. And that little disk is a better monument to what this company actually built than anything you'll ever find printed in a business school textbook. WordPerfect didn't lose because it built a worse product than its competitor. For years, in almost every meaningful way, it built a genuinely better one, and the people who used it every day knew that better than anyone writing about the industry from the outside ever could. It lost because being deeply loved by the people who had already chosen you is not the same thing as being ready for the millions of people who hadn't chosen anything yet, arriving fresh onto brand new machines with brand new defaults already waiting for them. And it lost because in a true platform shift, the company that moves first and fastest tends to win the room, even when the company arriving second has quietly built something more careful, more considered, and in the eyes of the people who actually used both, something genuinely more thoughtful. That's a lesson that keeps repeating itself again and again across the history of technology, in industry after industry, and WordPerfect just happened to become one of the clearest and most quietly heartbreaking examples of it ever handed to an entire generation of American office workers who never asked for the lesson in the first place.